come to Africa to kill and had killed each other. Holden Roberto's war was over, his army defeated, and bloodied and bowed he fled to safety across the border into neighbouring Congo. Mr. Roberto, in the past few days, has not been over anxious to make any public statements.
Could you come tomorrow morning?
Could you just explain briefly, sir, what the situation is? Just very briefly. A few weeks ago, I met him again. He's back in Angola and leads remnants of his old political party. You won't remember me.
I met somewhere. I guess that I saw you somewhere.
I think the last time we met you were too busy. You were fighting a war. He still reckons he did the right thing to employ British mercenaries, even the infamous Callan.
I was impressed by their spirit of fighting. They were very good soldiers, especially Callan was for me a good example. He was maybe very young, and when I gave him too much power, so he lost his head. But as a soldier, he was a very good soldier, very good one.
You don't regret using the British?
No, not at all, not at all. They were anti-communist, and they were decided to help us. You know, some of them refused to be paid. They said, when you don't pay us, we are going to pay. When we will win, then we'll try to give us something, but not, they refused to be paid.
If Angola's communist government was ever to be ousted, there was only one man who could do it. Dr. Jonas Savimbi, the charismatic leader of the other anti-communist guerrilla movement, UNITA. Pro-West, he therefore expected Western support in his war against the communist MPLA government.
The MPLA have run away from elections, and today MPLA is controlling less and less territory.
If you cannot make any further headway in negotiations, or may you form a breakaway state here?
No, we never thought about breakaway states.
Of course not. But the West, and especially America, was shy of openly supporting him. After all, there were diamonds in Angola, and more importantly, oil that America was already exploiting. It would not do to aggravate the communist rulers. So Savimbi had to find an ally elsewhere, and it was barely believable that it might come from that great Satan of the African continent, South Africa. The regime that invented Soweto, that imprisoned Nelson Mandela, for apartheid itself. At first it was just a rumour, yet Savimbi's army had been doing well on the battlefields. He must be getting help from somebody, somewhere. Are there South African troops committed here by the South African government?
They are not. They are not South African troops committed by South African government here.
He couldn't admit it, could he? But very soon I'd have the chance to prove, sensationally, that he was lying. And it almost cost me my life. When Angola gained independence from Portugal in 1975 and the communist government took control, there was only one man capable of ousting it, Jonas Savimbi, leader of UNITA. But America and Britain didn't have the spine to give Savimbi the military backing he needed in his war, so he looked for it elsewhere, from the pariah of the African continent, apartheid South Africa. It was secret, until I discovered it. It was sheer accident and, well, an enormous stroke of luck that finally caught him out. I was at an airport in central Angola when I wandered into the building. I was in a corridor, and at the end of it I could hear two men talking, and surely I recognized the accent of one of them. After all, I was living at the time in South Africa. Came to a door, it was ajar, and I looked in and I saw a white man's leg. I could see the hem of his khaki shorts, his knee-length socks, and his suede desert boots. Unmistakably South African. It was a chance discovery that could have meant nothing, but it changed the course of the war and the history of Angola forever. I was convinced that the South African army was fighting for UNITA. But one man's leg didn't make an army. I needed more proof. I needed picture proof. And it wasn't long in coming. First, we got this secretly shot film of South African armoured cars well inside Angola. Then little by little we built up our catalogue of evidence until I was persuaded that this was not simply a small contingent of military advisors, non-combatants, but a full-scale army, battalion strength, fighting for UNITA, alongside UNITA, directing UNITA.
You see that they employ, okay.
A few days later, I flew into the port of Lobito. There'd been a hard fight for it, but now it was in Savimbi's hands. And yes, the South Africans had helped him. They were in his war right up to their necks in it.
Now, we've been in Angola for a fortnight now, and in that time a great deal of effort's been made to prevent us filming South African troops and their equipment. For example, just over a week ago at Silva Porto, further east, we saw two brand new Panhan-armoured cars manned by white soldiers. We asked them where they came from. They said they came from London, and they said it with a very strong, obvious South African accent. We were not allowed to film by Angolan soldiers. They'd received instructions from a white civilian. Again, he spoke to them with a very strong South African accent.
Who were the men I spoke to with South African accents?
I was not there, so we have many white people here. If not many, but some who are working for us. It does not mean that they are South Africans, or they are sent by South African government or by another government.
Well, if the people I spoke to were South African, and I'm convinced they were because of their accents and their uniforms, who are they committed by? What other government is acting as an agent for them? Could they be South African mercenaries?
We don't have South African mercenaries.
What Dr. Savimbi does admit to is the real possibility that Angola could well become a battleground in a confrontation between two major powers, South Africa and Russia. And the crunch will come the day the MPLA decides to use Russian pilots and the Russian MiG fighter jets to bomb South African armoured columns at present converging on Luanda.
But it never came to that, because the day after my report was transmitted, the forward units of Tiger Battalion of the South African Army stopped at this bridge that crosses the Kwanza River 70 miles south of the capital, Luanda. They turned around and went back home. And this was as close as Jonas Savimbi came to gaining power. Well, I had my world scoop, but I'd humiliated the South Africans, and they had long memories. And one day they would take their revenge in a place that the Angolans call the land at the end of the earth. The land at the end of the earth is in southeastern Angola. Savimbi had his headquarters there. In 1978, he invited me to join him. It would be as far into UNITA territory as any TV crew had ever been. I was surprised to be asked, considering the damage my scoop had done him. But Savimbi needed the oxygen of publicity, and I was on hand. It was a risk, clearly a dangerous undertaking, but my camera crew, Tom Phillips and Mickey Doyle, were willing to go for it with me.
We flew into southern Angola on the 5th of August, and we expected a welcome. UNITA seldom have visitors. Welcome, they sang, to our free Angola. Their president, Dr. Jonas Savimbi, had invited us for 10 days, an interview, see his camps, and then get out quickly. Everything seemed very relaxed, and we were going to interview and rendezvous with Savimbi by lorry. But early the following morning, as we left, we were ambushed. That ambush marked the beginning of the MPLA Cuban offensive against UNITA, and it marked too the beginning of our long march to find the man we'd come to interview, Dr. Jonas Savimbi. We headed north through thick bush, often just following elephant tracks. Then Mickey Doyle had blisters, and I had to cut off the dead skin around them with a knife. But they were septic and made worse by the dirt and the insects. The only way we found was to put him in a dugout canoe towed by oxen. And with a little help from his friends, Mickey Doyle continued the journey in a land canoe.
This morning, the three of us, Tom Phillips, Mickey Doyle and myself, went to see Colonel Jindondo and said that we'd had enough. I reminded him that we're now into our 4th week, and that we'd marched well over 300 miles, that we wanted an escort south to the airstrip and out. Well, he reminded me that yesterday afternoon,
Two MPLA helicopters landed between 60 and 80 men just south of us, about 8 miles south of here. He said he'd provide an escort, but almost certainly would be captured by the MPLA, and most certainly would be shot as mercenaries. It wasn't much of a choice, which is why we're now walking north with him again. But not in a straight line, always zigzagging, often turning back on ourselves as our UNITA escort dodged their enemy's patrols. And then suddenly, like turning a street corner, after 2 months, we found him. We'd found Savimbi. We had arrived. It was an impressive show of support. He's a master of propaganda, but Savimbi is in a corner. And despite what he told his tribespeople, he is in trouble. Savimbi blames the Americans for not helping to protect him. The Americans are trying to make your allies drop you, to stop the supply of arms and money.
In short term, the Americans, they may play this card, which is wrong. Anyway, it's wrong. On all principles, it's wrong. But they will fail. And what we have to do is to be careful enough not to be crushed by them, by allies, the so-called allies, to survive. And I think after 6 months, 1 year, they will understand the strategic value of the struggle of UNITA. They will come to us. That time, then, we are going to deliver the goods.
General Savimbi boasts in UNITA 12,000 men, all of them trained and armed. Certainly they seem very well supplied with the new French anti-tank missiles that were being used against the Cuban tanks. They train men and women. The weapons we saw were AK-47s, FN rifles. This was an AK being used for the first time by a 14-year-old. Probably last week he was herding his father's cattle. Savimbi boasts enough arms and ammunition for another 3 years. And from what we could see, we had no reason to doubt him. Then they said, film that empty piece of land. We filmed, not knowing why, and on order, from nowhere, an ambush. Effective. The camp we saw was large. It contained 300 or 400 people, well supplied. The people were well fed, many of them local tribespeople who came in having their first real meal for a while. We saw many queues. This was a silent queue outside a small clinic. UNITA treats the local people as well as its own wounded, but only the lightly wounded, the seriously wounded, die. And for the first time, UNITA showed us MPLA prisoners, 5 they had captured some months before, looking very thin, looking very frightened. I asked the commandant of the camp, what will happen to these men? They will be re-educated, he said. Dr. Savimbi is confident that sooner or later, the Western powers, including the Americans, will realize his value as a pro-Western, anti-communist African leader. As these men march, they often sing a rhyme. It goes something like this. We cannot win this war, but neither can the MPLA. We know that. Without the Cubans, they are lost. We know it, and so do they. Michael Nicholson, News at 10, with ITN camera crew Tom Phillips and Mickey Doyle, with the UNITA forces in Angola. But for once, my ITN sign-off didn't end my report. His troops marched on, and so did we. Savimbi said he could get us across the Southwest African border, but the South Africans refused.
They would allow Mickey and Tom to cross the river at the border, but not me, absolutely not me. The South Africans had long memories and had finally taken their revenge on me for exposing them 3 years before. We were stranded. Mickey and Tom could have gone across without me, but they refused. We have come this far together, they said. We will go on together. But for how much longer? We were hundreds of miles from anywhere, in this, one of the most remote corners of Africa. And if the communists captured us, they could shoot us.
Now, our problems were not only fatigue, but food. Eating mealie and water for most of the time, until sometimes someone would go out and manage to shoot a deer. And then we would eat meat for days, sometimes be sick because of it. Our problem, too, was our morale. We seemed to be moving in no particular direction. We were going east-west, sometimes even north.
By this time, we thought that everybody back at home had given us up for dead. We even began to suspect that being such a burden to UNITA, Savimbi might be tempted to have us quietly disposed of. We were getting thinner and ever more despairing of getting out alive. But unknown to us, a rescue mission was being put together in great secrecy at ITN in London. My editor liaised with UNITA using coded radio messages to confirm that we were still alive and where we were located.
Then, after another 2.5 months, nearing our 4th month in Angola, we came to the southeastern corner of the country. We waited close to a Portuguese airstrip for 2 weeks, not knowing what was going to happen to us. Then the message came through that maybe a plane was coming in. And on Friday night last, as we were sitting round our fire, the plane landed just in the darkness.
Nearly 4 months. A 10-day trip that eventually lasted 110. I lost 2.5 stone. My wife Diana asked me not to try it again, and with such a beard, my 2 small sons called me Rip Van Winkle. Now, we reporters and camera crews take silly risks sometimes to get our story, but that trek into Angola must rank as one of the silliest. I do not recommend it.